CBDFX's CBD products are formulated to boost overall wellness and deliver calm vibes for daytime and nighttime use. CBDFX uses only organically grown hemp and all-natural ingredients. CBDFX's best-selling line of CBD products features wellness-boosting CBD and legal Delta-9 THC gummies, oil tinctures, capsules, pens, and other products. Visit CBDFX.com today and use code GENIUS to get 25% off site-wide, plus a free CBD bath bomb with your first purchase. The code is GENIUS, GENIUS. Don't miss this special 25% off offer for Finding Genius listeners, only at CBDFX.com. Offer expires August 31st, 2023. Feel the difference with CBDFX. Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers, because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button, and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD, and working on a product to help people overcome these problems, because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. My guest is Danielle Clode. She's the author of award-winning Australian books, the most recent of which is Koala. Her writing usually talks about natural history, essay, science writing, historical fiction, and some children's books as well. So glad to speak to her. Danielle, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background and what turned you into a writer, and then I want to ask you about your Koala book.
Sure. Well, I started my career as a conservation biologist, so that's what I trained in at university. So I've always had a pretty long interest in conservation and the environment. I had a bit of an unusual upbringing, so I spent a lot of my parents lived on a boat, so I spent a lot of time in wilderness areas, I guess, and that gave me a real appreciation for the diversity of the Australian environment and wild places. But I think when I finished my degree in conservation biology, I kind of fell into science writing, really, and discovered that was something I was really passionate about and really enjoyed doing. So I've pretty much been a science writer, broadly environmental writer, ever since.
Oh, very nice. Okay. What's your recent book, Koala? Is it about like the live koalas, or what's it about?
So Koala is an exploration of trying to understand the history of koalas, where they came from. I mean, koalas are one of the most iconic, famous animals, especially in conservation. They're sort of a flagship species for conservation. They generate a huge amount of public interest. They generate a huge amount of funding. People are really concerned about, if they're going extinct. And yet there's a lot of anomalies in koalas. Where I live in the Adelaide Hills, which is about in the centre of Australia, down the bottom on the south coast, they're really common here. So I see them not infrequently wandering through my backyard, bellowing in the trees. So I was really interested to know why it is that they're common in some places, and in other places they're in dire straits and disappearing.
You literally had some on your property that would wander around?
Yeah, I live in a rural property, so I have a reasonably big patch of bush, what we call bush, so a forest, I suppose. So yeah, koalas are not uncommon. They people see them every now and again wandering across the road, or in trees alongside the roads, or on walking tracks, looking down at you. It's a really lucky place to be in terms of looking at koalas.
Yeah, that's so cool. My wife's from Zimbabwe and lived in South Africa for like 20 years, and she said little spider monkeys would come in if the windows were open and like steal silverware and shiny things. And it's so weird to have, someone like you that has koalas in their yard. It's just, it's so strange.
Yeah. People often report them coming down to drink from, they drink from bird baths or swimming pools in hot weather, or, wander past the lounge room window and have a look at you, see what you're up to. They're not fortunately, they get in your house a lot less often than little monkeys do.
Yeah, I've always wanted to hug one, hold one. I've heard that, they're not very friendly or anything, but that's like my life's dream, is to come to Australia and just hold a koala for 30 seconds or something. I think it'd be really cool.
Well, it's certainly an ambition of a lot of visitors to Australia. And, koalas are generally fairly calm animals. They're not easily flustered or upset. So they've got a fairly nice temperament, really. Not all koalas are keen on being held. You wouldn't want to do that to a wild koala. They've got really large claws and they can certainly bite. So you want to keep clear of wild koalas. But ones that have been raised in zoos, they're very carefully selected to be comfortable with people, and they're only ever put in those situations if they want to be there. So the zoos are generally pretty good. If the koala decides to head off, then that's it. That's over for the day. And they only do the holdings for, about 15, 20 minutes for each koala, because koalas aren't awake for very long. So they lose interest in that activity very quickly. But they're generally trained to be comfortable, at least being patted by a person or in close contact with a person. So those experiences are pretty special in Australian zoos, but they do have to be pretty carefully managed.
Has anyone been able to tame them? Like, wild ones, if you feed them, and can you eventually tame them and hang out with them, or they're just irretrievably wild?
No, they are very amiable animals. So they become relatively comfortable with human company on occasion. Different animals, obviously there's personality differences. So some never become comfortable with people, but a lot of others do. Like I said, they're not particularly skittish or anxious animals the way some species are. I guess the issue with koalas is their difficulty keeping them in captivity is their diet. So it's really, really hard to provide a good diet and a healthy diet to a wild koala without it being in the wild. So you really have to have a forest of eucalypt trees to feed an individual koala. So most koalas need an area of forest about the size of at least a foot, an oval, a sports field. And some koalas, if they're poor quality eucalypts, it'll have to be, the size of Central Park. It's a huge area of forest required to successfully support a koala. So that's the difficulty of having wild koalas and the limitation on keeping them in captivity. They're one of the most expensive animals to keep in captivity in a zoo.
They only eat eucalyptus, or what else do they eat?
They are pretty much exclusively eucalypt. They're specialist eucalypt feeders, which is really unusual because eucalypts have a really high level of toxicity. So most mammals, when they eat eucalypts, they feel sick, basically. So koalas have to be very selective in the eucalypts that they eat. They'll only eat a small range of eucalypts. So there's 900 species of eucalypt trees in Australia. Koalas are known to eat about 70. They do occasionally eat a few other things, but predominantly it's eucalypts. And of those 70, one koala will only eat 3, maybe 10 different species. So they're very, very particular because they have to have exactly the right eucalypt that they are capable of breaking down and extracting nutrients from. And that's a really complex process for a koala.
Yeah, I heard they sleep 20 hours a day. Why don't they get anything done if they sleep all the time?
Well, you could ask the same thing of your dog or your cat, I suspect. They sleep a lot of the time too. Koalas get a bit of a bad rap for sleeping all the time. And it's true, they spend 90% of their life asleep in a tree. And people have proposed, in the past, it's a bit of a myth that koalas do this because they eat toxic leaves and it impacts on their brain and they have to save energy and all that sort of thing. None of that seems to be true. They get exactly the same amount they eat exactly the same amount of leaves as a sheep does grass. If they weren't getting enough nutrients out of their food, they'd have to be awake longer and feeding longer. So it doesn't really make sense that they're saving energy by sleeping. What seems to be the case is that they live in a tree. They're surrounded by their food for the day or the night. They don't need to go anywhere. They're safest if they sit still. So their best form of defense is to curl up in a little ball and be invisible, which they are extremely good at. They're very hard to spot when they're in trees and not moving. And so they sleep because they can. They don't need to be awake to be worried about predators or hunting around looking for food. they can digest their food while they're asleep. So unlike another, a sheep or something that has to be awake to chew its cud, koalas just do it all in their stomach. So why not sleep if you can? And they quite an art form of sleeping very comfortably in trees, as I'm sure you've seen from the photos.
CBD-FX full-spectrum and broad-spectrum CBD products are formulated to boost overall wellness and deliver calm vibes for daytime and nighttime use. CBD-FX is offering our listeners an exclusive 25% off, which I think is very generous, plus a free CBD bath bomb with your first purchase when you use the code GENIUS. Don't miss this special 25% off offer for Finding Genius listeners only at cbdfx.com. Offer expires August 31st, 2023. Feel the difference with CBD-FX.
So what other interesting things have you learned about observing them and hanging out with them that other people don't know?
Look, I think they're a greatly underestimated animal. I think because, they're awake at night, they're not active for very long, we tend to underestimate how diverse and interesting they are. The way they feed on the eucalypts, the way they've become a specialist of eucalypt trees, which very few other animals can successfully feed on, is quite remarkable. And they do it by having an amazing gut biome. We've increasingly come to appreciate how important the microbes in our stomachs are for our own health. But in koalas, it really is a matter of life or death. So they have to receive, the exactly right family of microbacteria in their stomach when they're weaned by their mothers, in order to be able to feed on the trees that are in their area. So having these highly adaptable and variable gut biomes is probably the secret to the koala's success and why it's been able to exploit such a wide range of different eucalypt forests across Australia, because each koala has their own unique gut biome that allows it to eat the trees in the area where it's been raised.
Well, what's interesting about the microbes in their gut microbiome? Have they been sampled and characterized, metagenomics? Like what's been
Yeah, research in this field is really interesting, and it's only just, it's fairly recent research, so it hasn't been studied a lot yet, although that's happening increasingly. It's a really, really complicated area. I think this was the most difficult part of my book to write, was trying to make sense of how leaves are broken down, the chemistry, and, because there's all these complex things about how the protein, because the plants are actually responding to being eaten, and they're actively trying to stop herbivores from eating them by having really complicated proteins and toxins and all of these things and cellulose to try and protect their nutrients. And so it's like this little chemical warfare going on in the forest all the time. And the koalas also have an amazing liver, which detoxifies the eucalypts. So the bacteria in the gut breaking down the cellulose, because mammals can't break down cellulose on their own. They all need to have gut bacteria to do that. We rely on bacteria to do that. All mammals that eat plant matter do that. But the toxins are broken down by the liver, and koalas have a double dose of the genes needed for detoxifying, and they're so good at doing this. Just to give you an example, it also makes them really hard to give medicine to, because they treat medicine as a toxin as well. So if a human has chlamydia, for example, it's a 3-day dose of medication to treat that chlamydia. If a koala has chlamydia, it's a 30-day dose of medication, because it has to be spread out over a longer time so that they don't upset the gut bacteria, but also they're extremely good at removing that medication from their system.
Yeah, I've heard there's a koala retrovirus that's changing the population over. It's, I guess, killing certain ones, and then other ones that now have the retrovirus where it's endogenized, they're breeding, and it's creating, I guess, a slightly different version of the koalas. Like what do you see? What's the truth of it?
Yeah, look, retroviruses are a really weird and amazing thing. And, humans have our own batch of retroviruses that have, infiltrated our genome through our evolutionary history, and so do koalas. And retroviruses are, the koala retrovirus it creates a disease a little bit like AIDS. So it attacks the immune system, and the danger with the retroviruses that are currently sweeping through the northern koala population, so these are the ones that are on the east coast of Australia, are that they exacerbate other diseases that koalas suffer from. And chlamydia is one of the worst of these. So, like AIDS, if a koala has this retrovirus, then other diseases become much worse. So this is probably one of the reasons that that population is particularly struggling at the moment, is the presence of those retroviruses. I mean, over time, we'd expect those retroviruses to become milder, through selecting for stronger individuals, I suppose, and other factors that operate in diseases. And they do increase the diversity, they also increase the mutation rates in animals, which can be beneficial and it can be negative. So yeah, it does. Retroviruses are a part of every species evolution.
Well, what's happening to the koalas that have it but are not are doing okay with it? Are they any different from the koalas that don't have it? Any differences, or are they the same?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, these sort of factors occur over a long period of time, so we can only kind of assess what's happening currently on the basis of what's happened in the past. That we have evidence of retroviruses in our own genomes from the past that obviously we've come to accommodate. Again, it's like that chemical warfare in the forest that's constantly going on. You don't notice it because it happens over such a slow time scale and you're only seeing one particular moment in time. Same thing's happening in our genetic makeup, with ourselves and, viruses and bacteria and stuff. We're engaging in a constant warfare with protecting ourselves from them while we're trying to utilize our resources to advance themselves. So it's really difficult to see what the direct impact is at the moment. We'll only really know that over time.
Yeah, what happened? I guess there was huge wildfires a year or two ago, maybe more, in Australia, and a lot of habitat probably got destroyed. And I know there was a center to rescue koalas and all that, and I donated to it and everything. But what's been your, you've been there on the ground, like what have you seen with the wildfires and the habitats of koalas over the past few years?
Yeah, for sure. The increasing frequency of fires in Australia has been really major and clear impact of climate change. Australia has always had a lot of fires, a natural part of our ecosystem, and a lot of our species are adapted to coping with them. They're never pleasant things to have happen, but nonetheless, most species can manage, the ones that are in those fire areas. Koalas particularly vulnerable to fires individually because, of course, they can't get away from them. They can't fly away. They can't really run away. All they can do is, go into cool gullies or up the tops of trees and hope that it's a cool fire. But with the fires becoming hotter and more severe and more frequent, this makes it really difficult for koalas to survive. And it also means that in areas where the fires have burnt, there's not enough koalas or forests left to repopulate the new forest back. So the koalas can't re-establish their populations. So fires have been responsible for wiping out koalas in a number of different areas. It is really quite severe. Near me, we had a fire on Kangaroo Island, which is a place where the koalas have been established for their safety. So they're a translocated population. It's one of the biggest and healthiest populations in the country. It had 48,000 koalas on the island before the fires that impacted there a couple of years ago, and 40,000 individuals are estimated to have died in those fires. So one fire can have an absolutely massive impact on koala populations, and that was really apparent in the East Coast fires and in the Black Summer fires.
Are there different species of koalas? Like, are there any on Tasmania that are different from, in Australia or different parts of Australia? Are they radically different?
There used to be a thought that there were different species of koalas in Australia, but, the recent research suggests no, they're all the same. There's a slight difference there's two populations which are slightly different in form. So the northern koalas up the east coast of Australia are a bit smaller. They have thinner pelts, slightly different colour. So they're a bit more adapted to the hot weather, basically. And the southern koalas, which stretch across the southeastern coastline, tend to be bigger. They're quite a bit bigger and much thicker pelts, but they're actually the same species. There's no species difference between them. And there's no koalas in Tasmania or Western Australia. So they may have been there in the past, and they certainly were in Western Australia in the past. They've gone extinct with the retraction of the forests.
Oh, no. There's no Perth koalas?
No, there's some koalas in Perth, only in the wildlife parks. I'm sure koalas would love to re-establish themselves in WA. They were certainly there 45,000 years ago, so there's no reason why they couldn't come back. But whether that would be acceptable to the current human residents is another matter.
So what are some of the questions that you're looking to answer about koalas, or what big questions that you explore in your book?
I guess the big question I was interested in the book is why are they doing so well in some parts of Australia and not so well in others? And what does that mean? Koalas are often pitched as an animal that's made bad life choices. It eats toxic leaves, it sleeps all the time, it's not very bright. We often pitch it like pandas as an animal that's doomed to extinction. And this is something that recurs through the literature. We hear about them. Inevitably, they're going to go extinct. My research suggests that, that's not the case at all. They're actually supremely well adapted to their environment, of course, as you'd expect most animals to be. But also, they're actually incredibly resilient. They have suffered from near extinction events several times in their past, some caused by humans, some not, but they bounce back remarkably well. So I think the thing for me is that koalas are an incredibly resilient species, and if they're doing badly, we are really doing something wrong with our environment. There's something they're like the canary in the coal mine. I mean, it's the koala in the forest. A healthy koala population, they're a peak species for a forest. So if you've got a healthy koala population, you've got a really healthy forest system, Australian forest system. So we really should be using koala populations as an indicator of how well we're managing our forests and our natural environment. And at the moment, we're not doing that well.
Okay. Well, what do you think will be the future of koalas in Australia over the next few years? A long term, I know it's hard to predict, but maybe the next few years. What do you see?
Yeah, look, I mean, certain populations will continue doing fine. In the southern populations are probably fairly stable for the moment. The East Coast populations are definitely in dire straits, and the main factor causing that is continued land clearance and continued native forest logging. So we're still logging the forest, which changes the nature of the forest for the koalas. It simply removes habitat, but it also changes the types of trees that the koalas feed on are no longer there. So those are the two big factors, and they're the things that are happening in the East Coast. We're generally speaking, as a broad principle, we need to do better at protecting our trees, replacing and expanding the tree coverage. That's a major factor in mitigating climate change. So we all need to be doing that, not just people who have koalas in their forests, but people all around the world. We need to be doing much better at looking after our trees and making sure they're able to look after us.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, very good. What's the best way for people to find out more about your work? I mean, with you, it's pretty direct, read your book. So the Koala book, is it also like a movie or is it just a book? And if so, where can people get it?
Yeah, so the Koala book is available at the moment in hardback in the US and worldwide. It'll be issued in paperback next year. And, if you want to find out more about my work, you can look on my website. So it's danielleclode.com.au, or follow me on Twitter or Instagram or any of those social media places. I've got a pretty recognizable name, so I'm pretty easy to find.
Well, very good. Well, Danielle, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. And maybe one day I can visit you and hang out with some of the koalas in your yard.
That sounds great.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Remember, before you go, check out cbdfx.com for the best in organic, all-natural CBD products, both for you and your pets. Boost your wellness today and get 25% off your first order, plus get a free CBD bath bomb when you use code GENIUS at checkout. That's code GENIUS. Don't miss this special 25% off offer for Finding Genius listeners only at cbdfx.com. Offer expires August 31st, 2023. Feel the difference with CBDFX.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.